Welcome to Transformation 2.0, the podcast for change leaders. My name is Chamara, and in each episode, we bring you real conversations with executives, innovators, and experts who are shaping the future of business. Whether you are leading a team, scaling a company, or navigating the challenges of transformation, this podcast will provide you with insights, strategies, and inspiration to drive meaningful change. Join us as we explore what it takes to lead, adapt, and thrive in an ever-evolving world. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Transformation 2.0. I've got Taural with me again today. We are doing as my co-host, but we are also inviting Lisa Merryweather, a former top-tier corporate M&A partner, into the discussion, and we're going to be talking about Generation X perspective on society and why Gen X, as lucked out, or as we titled it, is the real loser generation. But we're not talking about us as being losers. We're talking about Gen X as being the ones that lucked out of what's happening in the society today. So welcome to the podcast, Taural, again. And Lisa, welcome today as well.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously you all know both myself and Taural. We're not going to go into the details of our profiles, but I'll give you a little bit of a big background about Lisa. So Lisa, as I said earlier, is a former top-tier corporate M&A partner with over 25 years of experience leading billion-dollar business takeovers and also SME sales and everything in between. She has acted for some of Australia's most recognized companies and was a managing director of her own boutique firm, Merryweather Law. Today, Lisa is self-employed as a coach and a mentor and helping professional advisors and founders navigate the roller coaster of exits and corporate transactions, not just from a technical standpoint, but also through the personal and emotional journey that accompanies such life-changing events. Beyond her legal career, Lisa has become thought leader on lived experience of founders and Gen X professionals, recently sparking discussions with her reflections on the Economist article, Why Gen X is the Real Loser Generation. So Lisa, tell us a little bit about why you shared that article and what your thoughts were when you actually shared that article.
Thanks. My original interest in it is that I guess as I reflect on my own journey, I've been focusing a lot on this sort of balance between the level of personal responsibility we take for professional development. And I don't know about you, but I feel as though even in our generation, maybe the generation before, very personal focus. So we're all about what we can do to improve ourselves and what steps we can take. But in isolation, sort of without taking into account and to use one of my favourite words being thrown around at the minute, the tailwinds or headwinds within which we personally sort of find ourselves. So, and that's great because we need to have some level of attention and an ability to reflect on our own sort of growth. But if we only focus on that sort of aspect, our own personal situation, then we can be quite distorted. So, because we operate within a society and those societal headwinds can have an impact, both as headwinds or as tailwinds. So if we ignore, for example, the privileges that we've received, then we can have an inflated ego. That means that as a leader, we're perhaps not as empathic. We're not able to see the advantages that we received ourselves, and we expect everyone else to be able to do what we did. And also our identity is then very connected with our success in that role, and we can feel quite defensive if something sort of comes our way to knock us off that perch. So if we don't acknowledge the headwinds, then we are, for example, perhaps in a high performance industry where perfectionism is rife and we're sort of edging towards that unhealthy sort of use of perfectionism, then we can be overly focused on the inner critic with us And again, too much personal focus on what we've done wrong or why didn't we succeed as much as the person next to us. And again, no reflection on the societal sort of or cultural context that's perhaps not aided us as much as it has the person next to us. So I've been quite fascinated by how we tread these lines carefully. And that's not to say that when we look at those sort of societal or cultural headwinds, because we don't want to tip into that place of going, oh, that's so unfair, woe is me, victim. So that's not good either. So it's this lovely balance of sort of saying, well, why is that important? It's important so that we can, bring a little bit of compassion and kindness and understanding to ourselves so that from that and awareness, so that then we can have the agency that we need to sort of move forward and through that. So, and you did invite an ex-lawyer onto this show. And so some habits die hard. I will keep talking. I'll get to the point of the actual article in a minute, but it was in that context that I saw this article. I went, oh, that's interesting. I have thought about a lot of the societal headwinds that I've experienced personally, but not the economic one. So this was a new lens through which to view this perspective. I mean, it was weird. Yes, the GFC was relevant to my sort of career and had an impact on my professional sort of momentum, I guess, but I never really took it into account. I didn't have that societal sort of overlay to go, oh, that's a fascinating explanation. And it made a lot of sense. Like, obviously, the GFC is not great for an M&A lawyer, and certainly one who'd just been made partner at that juncture. So yeah, that sort of it caught my attention from those perspectives.
No, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. And you shared some great insights around, how different generations show personal development. I really like that. I had never thought about it that way, actually. I do put a lot of effort in, like, looking at where I am and sort of like where I want to take myself. But I never really thought about it that, we have a different perspective on self-improvement compared to other generations. That's fascinating. And obviously, the focus of the episode today is, about exploring Gen X experience through the lens of three leaders, the three of us, yourself, myself, Lisa, and me, and Taural. We are all Gen Xers, and obviously, we're talking about how each of us have nearly 30 years of experience or nearly 100 years of experience between the three of us. That's a fascinating
90.
thought.
Let's not go too far. 90.
But it's interesting that you mentioned about the GFC and the impact of GFC. And obviously, like Taural, you were traveling around different countries during the GFC. So maybe you can share a little bit of the perspective that you saw during that period. Were you in Germany at the time, or were you in the US during GFC?
I was in Germany at the time, and
Germany, okay. So
I
yeah, I'd
had
love to hear about what your experience was. Obviously, like I was in, I think either Singapore or had just moved to Australia. Yeah, moved back to Australia at the time. So yeah, for me, it was more the Asian Pacific context is what I remember, but not the European context or the American context. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
on a very personal level, I had made a decision that I was going to leave the professional services organization that I was in and essentially do my own thing. And that translated into sort of being a contractor. And I had a couple of significant hoops that I had to jump through in order to secure that. One was around getting, to get through procurement for larger organizations to be a one-person show. You would need essentially a supplier number. And I had just navigated getting a supplier number for a massive, internationally known large organization. I was very pleased that I did that. And then I navigated the ins and outs of getting a significant contract signed with my first customer in that organization. And then I recall as very pleased that I'd sort of got myself set up after a long amount of thinking and lobbying for it. And then to have a conversation, prior to Christmas with the senior stakeholder there saying, all right, this is happening. We're going to keep you, but that contract that was supposed to, be consumed within 3 months, that's probably going to be the only contract you get for the year. And having 4 small kids at home, and I was like, oh my goodness, well, gotta figure out how to make that happen. And look, fortunately, it worked out. But it was from a very personal level, it had a significant impact. I will say, moving to Australia, many years afterwards, I moved to Australia in 2014. I had the sense that the scars in Australia and also in the United States were deeper than they were necessarily in Europe. Clearly, it impacted the market, but and I was in the automotive sector. I was servicing automotive clients, and their point of view was to be a defensive posture. Oh, the global financial crisis is happening. I would simply, and for any American listeners, I would simply say the financial systems, while still prone to abuse and misuse and all sorts of shenanigans, weren't as fragile or as simplistically set up in bad ways that the American structures were. So I don't think that they were susceptible to really just some of the stupid decisions and some of the vehicles they'd made. It just, you couldn't do that in Europe. So we weren't necessarily hit. So what impacted me was a defensive posture by the organization I was working with. Oh, this is going to impact our revenue bottom line, probably because we have a significant amount of sales in North America. But they could also recoup that in other markets to a certain extent. So while that was probably about a year, probably by the end of that first year, I was negotiating the next contracts that were high value and guaranteed moving forward. So it didn't impact me as much, I think, as it probably would have done others in the United States, in North America, or potentially in Australia.
Thank you for sharing that, and it's interesting. To me, I think I actually moved to Australia in 2007, as I said earlier. So I think GFC started about mid-2007 from memory. And it went on until about mid-2009. So I had, I think, just joined Commonwealth Bank at the time. So I had just left semiconductor industry and moved into financial services, completely new industry, right? So, and I think, like, to me, I think I was probably on the other side of that experience you described, Taural, because I felt like the semiconductor industry was actually gonna be quite badly going through a downturn during the economic downturn in the GFC, right? But I didn't obviously foresee that. But semiconductors has always been quite a choppy industry. It has ups, troughs, peaks and troughs almost every 2 years. And I think, like, when I left Singapore in 2007, we had just come out of one trough and we were just starting to grow. But I think, like, around mid 2008, again, it started to go down. But I think that one hit the semiconductor market quite badly because of the GFC. So I had just moved back to Australia at the time and had with the Combank, and I think, like, they had started their co-bank modernization. So I was actually getting into quite a large program of work at the time. So I think from that perspective, I got lucky. But I think, like, thinking about it though, I think after the co-bank modernization, Combank went through outsourcing and offshoring a lot of their services. And I went through that then thinking about, okay, what do I do, right? The Combank gave me the option to stay, or IBM made me an offer to join them. IBM was one of the partners Combank onboarded at the time. They made an offer for me to join, but then I actually chose to stay with the Combank. But then shortly after, I left Combank and joined consulting anyway. So I think, like, like the GFC perspective for me was actually kind of like double-sided. For me, I think I was going through a lot of readapting to the Australian culture again, because even though I had studied here for uni, when I lived in Southeast Asia for 10 years, I kind of got used to the way of life there. And then coming back to Sydney and then getting used to Sydney life again was quite interesting amid the GFC. But I think, like, a lot of people that I was working side by side with at the time, when Combank did the offshoring in the 2009s, just coming out of the GFC, actually had their roles impacted. And I think what I remember was actually, like, when their roles were impacted, I think Commonwealth Bank was probably one of the better organizations that did the transitions in a graceful way, to be honest. I think I've seen much more brutal transitions since then, right? And I think now, I think it's actually becoming such commonplace. I feel like a lot of the large organizations actually don't have a lot of care in the world when they do this sort of thing. And that's what really worries me in the future, especially with AI impacting roles and people starting to, like,
Yep, sorry, just thinking back, that was a little while ago for me, but so yeah, that was an interesting time, the GFC, and typically, I think that article referred to as it being a typical time of growth, and that's when you're sort of bedding down and you're heading into those sort of middle management ranks. And if you were impacted by that, then obviously your sort of progress financially might have been impacted, etc. And so, interestingly, then when you feed that into maybe in 10 years' time and you're using that rear view mirror to reflect, because midlife is one of those times that can raise all sorts of interesting questions. There's various studies on it. I've just coincidentally listened to a very good podcast that talked specifically about midlife from a psychological perspective. So given that it was presented by a psychologist, they did not talk about the GFC, funnily enough. But what they did talk about were just these sort of natural life stages that we go through, and that once we are in midlife, which surprisingly is quite a long period of time, we sort of approach this new stage and this new way of looking at things, but we're not conscious of that fact. So we can get into a stage where we can feel a bit stuck. We move from a time of being what does the world, or doing things for the world, so that accumulation and working for people and sort of making our way in the world. And then we get to midlife and we're starting to go, oh, but what do I want? The actual podcast referred to what does the soul want, but that went in a direction that I just don't think I can do justice to. And so within that context, we're sort of shifting into this other sort of space, but perhaps without a real awareness of it. And then, yes, the U-curve, the U-bend study, which is this philosophy that in our sort of we're feeling fantastic as kids and maybe teenagers, and then we sort of hit our 20s and it's sort of like apparently a downward slide from sort of there. So we're sort of feeling okay, but gradually we're getting further and further down. And apparently it's around 44 that we hit our sort of the bottom of the U, and that takes into account this sandwich generation piece that we're perhaps the first to experience, which is I was interested in it. I mean, obviously from a psychological perspective, especially from a female perspective, that's I've sort of looked at it from the mental load and the time and the impact on your career, like when you've got young children and parents, like how does one work and accumulate wealth? So it should still be in a good wealth building phase there, but so distracted and fragmented, it's really hard to just focus on wealth creation and building a career when your attention and stage in life requires you to be pulled in these other directions. So again, I'd thought about it from that perspective, had not focused on that sort of wealth building or just that amount of money that goes out the door. From that article, it suggested that we're just spending more on caring for other people rather than ourselves, yeah, so I just thought it was some really interesting fascinations. Now, the one piece of hope, because this podcast that I listened to was from a psychologist, so she does like to leave you with a bit of hope. And she did say that you might be feeling like the happiness curve might be going down, but happiness is obviously not just a one and done thing. So we're sort of just not
Find new
always in a state of
purposes.
happiness. And apparently we are accumulating wisdom in this phase. We are heading into our very wise phase. So we there's hope to be had in this sort of bottom of the U that we apparently find ourselves in.
No, that's fascinating. I think, comparing the financial perspective and the psychological perspective, I had not really thought about it from a psychological perspective before. So to me, it's definitely a new lens to explore this through. But I think, like, for me, what I really find interesting is that, lately I've actually found a little bit more purpose in terms of what we do, right? And to me, I feel like that's actually given me like a second win. So maybe that's actually something that happens kind of like when we start accumulating that wisdom, because that once you accumulate enough wisdom, you kind of realize, yeah, what you've been doing might actually not be what's really giving you energy, and then you really start to learn more about yourself. Nothing like, to me, like I discovered a lot about me in my early 50s. So to me, I think that's given me a lot of different perspective around how I've been behaving in this world. But I think, like, just thinking about it in terms of how uh, different things that you engage with can actually give you a different perspective on what you're doing, and then being able to, like, create that shared purpose that sometimes gives you a second win has been quite a blessing for me. Taural, what's your perspective in terms of how the level of energy you've had over the years as you go through the sort of the Middle Ages and come to where we are today?
I wanted to make a point, and I will answer your question, but I wanted to make a point about the problem I have with the term Gen X. I don't think it's a, let me put it this way. I think it was designed to help me, for me to buy more things, or to to determine, to inform my purchasing in the marketplace. I'm not sure if there's a lot of statistical veracity to Gen X, and it's also, I think, a highly ethnocentric term. I think if my parents, who were hippies, raised me as a Gen Xer, and my life in the West, they experienced a good amount of wealth and political stability, and yes, there was the worries of the Cold War, that sort of thing, but it was very different than someone who grew up in China at the time. Somebody who was born in 1970, as I was born in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, had parents who had survived in some way, shape, or form a variety of societal fragmentation and war, and so their being a Gen X does not equate. There's not an analog to my being a Gen X. I just have general problems with that. What I think makes sense is to talk about that. So Gen X is kind of a label for a cohort, right? A cohort. We've talked about two other things, and I think it's probably useful to mention the framework, because we talked about period effects. The GFC was a period effect. We all sort of experienced that, right? There's other, World War II was a period effect, right? There's all period effects that we can talk about, which impact everyone. I think that's probably a relevant and interesting point, as evidenced by the fact that we gave quite a bit of airtime to the GFC experience. The third point would be what I would call stage effects, and that's when we talk about the U-bend of life. We graduate through various stages of life, and as we do that, our lived experience and where we are biologically, psychologically, spiritually, if that's something that's different, right? So the idea of Gen X is sort of a short-term and easy label to talk about it, I think, is interesting, but I want to acknowledge the poverty of that as an actual explanatory mechanism. Now that I got that out of the way, sorry, I had to talk.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's good that you brought it up, because we did talk a lot about GFC. We did talk about the impact of that, but we didn't actually look at some of the other macro factors that happened around the on either side of it, and how some of the other generations were impacted by them as well. The First World War and Second World War, and they all had impacts on previous generations. We were probably the one that was hit by the GFC. And whatever happened since, and I think obviously the digital disruptions happening now, and I think Gen Y, Gen Z, millennial, everyone's kind of caught up in that as well. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's go back to what your experience has been in terms of navigating through the sort of the midlife. And
this is a topic that is 100%, I think, primary in my thinking in general, as I'm living through it, trying to understand it. much more sensitive to others around me who are also sort of in a similar kind of cohort, or experiencing the stage of life. And as the case is, I've noticed in our author community, people tend to be captured by topics that are relevant to them. And it's one thing to be intellectually curious, but people are writing books about things to a large degree that are very much about their lived experience. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think so. For me, I'm very captivated by that topic. I've experienced, I think maybe I've hit the bottom of the U-bend and have, imagine a car careening along and then running into a wall and sliding along the wall and then eventually feeling, I kind of feel like I did that, but it's like I hit and I've been sliding on the bottom of the, the happiness barrier. And I'm starting to realize, wait a second, and I think the piece around identity is important. That's, at least it's a big aspect that I look at. And I think, Lisa, you talked about it, as a senior leader in an organization with a certain amount of power or perception or all the stuff that comes with it, we want to be meritorious and we want to be all people are equal. But if you're in a large complex organization and you sit in a seat of power, you get deference, you get treated differently, you hear different things, right? The pressure's there. I'm not diminishing that aspect of responsibility, but when you step out of that, the world feels very different. Right. So that's an identity piece. Likewise, we talk about the biology. One of the things that I think that's been really exciting about the group that we're all sort of involved in is a lot of folks of the similar age who are females are talking about perimenopause. It just was never on my radar, to be to be stupidly frank with you. And now I'm so much more sensitized and aware of it. And we've got really lovely people in our network who talk about the impact in the workplace. And I just think, oh my gosh. Likewise, there's very common facts about the hormonal, profile of males as they sort of reach this age. That's again part of identity. That's and then there's the thinking about, well, what do I want to be? We're living longer. So much conversation in the past 10 years about living longer in better health, right? We're not destined to live necessarily longer decrepit with a poor state of health. We can live longer in a more vital way than possibly previous other generations. So what does that mean for who I am, right? So I've been thinking about that in general. I don't have a solution. I can tell you it's very visceral for me, and I suspect I'm going to write a book about it.
So maybe that can be your next book.
Sorry,
go on, Lisa.
I was going to say, there is so much in that interplays with, some of the studies that have gone on with generations beforehand, and I was wondering that same thing, like midlife as a concept is longer than what it used to be. So that plays into this concept of we are living longer. And so, we modeled what we think turning 50 might look like, or what are we doing at 50 or 60? And that's probably quite different to what it is going to be for us, because we are hopefully have an ability to, live longer with a better quality of life. So I'm fascinated by all of those things.
I think the opportunities for us to live longer because technology is actually helping to improve the quality of care is definitely a valid point.
Although I would overlay that.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I do love to cut in. Again, you got a lawyer on. I can't.
I'm usually the one cutting in, so it's good to have someone else cutting in.
Excellent. Good. I'll take that role from you. I would say that, what is it, the generations below us, perhaps? Again, I'm all about vibe. That actually the first generation amongst us that will have perhaps a shorter lifespan than we are having. So traditionally we outlive the generations before us, and that's starting to change just because of all sorts of reasons that I won't go into here because they're not about Gen X, the Lisa generation. But but perhaps we've lucked in that respect. Perhaps it'll sort of miss us.
Slacker generation, not loser generation, slacker generation.
But hold that thought. Maybe that could be another episode that we can actually talk about why the future generations are not going to be living longer. But then I don't know if that's going to be a topic that's good for our podcast audience. So let me
still got the power to change.
That's it.
They're young.
let
They
me
can
ponder on
change.
it and think how we can actually engage with them in a different way and give them a different message to actually say, look, you know what, this is what you can do. But yeah, but I think what I want to talk about now is more just looking at, what's happening with technology and transformation, and then look at, what the Gen X's relationship is with what's happening now and the digital disruption. And I think like what I've experienced is obviously, as I said before we started the podcast, like there's a lot of change happening that's been happening for a while, but I think like what's happening now is just the pace of change is increasing a lot more. And I think, as I said before we started, I think there's going to be these multiple waves of impact that's going to be hitting. I think the Gen X's relationship with this, I feel like, is probably going to be the most tenuous because a lot of the sort of the generations before Gen X have kind of like moved off of their corporate lives and starting to sort of like set up their portfolio careers, and they kind of established their portfolio careers in most senses, or at least their investment portfolios are kind of like well sorted in most senses, right? And then the future generations after Gen X are kind of like, yes, they still have a little bit more time left up their sleeve, but Gen X kind of have probably another 10 or 15 years left in terms of years to accumulate. So we really need to knuckle down and focus on how we can actually accelerate that accumulation, right? So that kind of feel makes me feel like, to me, I think that's the perspective that I get when I think about the Gen X being the loser generation in terms of what's happening now, Lisa. And I think that's what I replied to your message post and shared with you as a thought, because generations after Gen X will still have time to do that, but Gen X has a kind of like that limited shelf life in terms of where they want to go. I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, Taural, maybe starting with, and then maybe after that from you, Lisa.
Look, I think limited shelf life. My experience is I suspect my goodbye date in certain industries has already been passed. Spent a good deal of time in technology, past 15 years probably. And I very clearly have aged out to a large degree. My ability to contribute because I'm not.
Can I cut in? When
Go
you
ahead, go
say
for it.
when you say when you say aged out, right? This is actually a real thing, right? The ageism. It's probably another thing that we can talk about. But there were quite a few posts that are doing the rounds on LinkedIn about ageism. But I'll post that for now, and we'll come back to it later. I'll let you keep going.
Maybe I should also be clear in my terms. I don't think I've aged out, but I think the perception of the people in technology to a large degree perceive me as having been aged out. So either at my age, you're ensconced in a senior leadership role where you're making decisions. But if you're not, if you're not kind of in that fortuitous position, it's difficult to kind of, get and people interpret that for different reasons. But that's just, I think that the fact is that's the case. I think that's probably less so true if I was to be, in a different industry, financial services or something like that. Could be a different, the age, the gray might be seen as wisdom, right? So I don't know. It's what I will say is when I was thinking about this quite a bit when I was in high school, probably a year or two before graduation, American high school. There was a big push to explain to us that we were not going to be able to have job security. And as opposed to my parents were, the social contract with commercial enterprises was that if you do your bit, you work with a company for a long period of time, you do your 20, 25 years, whatever, your social welfare is taken care of, because in America there's really not much of a safety net there, so that was provided for. And in fact, I think about my father retired as an engineer. His insurance that he had covered the family throughout, right? And even when he passed away, my mother was still able to live with his insurance, private insurance, which is a vital piece of being able to live well in the United States. Nowhere will you find that, right? And in fact, American corporations oftentimes hold your ability to get insurance through them as a power lever over you to a certain extent, right? That's the power differential in the United States. Anyway, I digress. I was told you're going to have to learn to, and this kind of plays back to what Lisa was talking about, you're going to have to be able to learn quicker You're going to have to be able to adapt quicker. You're going to have to be flexible geographically. You're going to have to be flexible in terms of verticals. That's just the skills that you need to survive. It's no longer about being a good, loyal corporate citizen to a corporate entity. It's about being able to navigate the uncertainty of what's coming your way. I don't know if any of you got that when you were younger, but that was something that I remember vividly, and that's sort of informed me.
No, definitely. It's something I've encountered quite a bit as well. Like even where I grew up in Sri Lanka, like the previous generations had the social nets that were established quite well. But I think that the modern generations don't really have that. And like I think our generation was probably the one that kind of saw the change happening kind of like smack in the middle as we were going out, leaving school, high school, and actually starting to wander off into uni or starting to look for jobs just after school in terms of looking for part-time jobs. So I definitely experienced that in Sri Lanka growing up. And then obviously when I was studying at uni here in Australia, I encountered it again, in terms of how things were changing in Australia as well. And I think like I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier, Taural, about sort of like the things that we learn that gives us resilience, and maybe talk about that a little bit in terms of Lisa's perspective as well on what's happening in the technology and transformation and the industry and with the digital disruption. Maybe Lisa, if you can take both topics and maybe cover off one after the other, right? Well, first talk about the digital disruptions and the Gen X's perspective on that from your viewpoint, and then let's talk about the agency and the leadership lessons and the resilience that Gen X's have established, which will serve them better, because this conversation is about saying that there is hope for the Gen X at the end of the tunnel, right? So I want to try and set the stage for that shift now.
Yeah, it's actually. This is where different people's life experiences is really fascinating too, because what Taural just mentioned, I remember hearing as a sort of almost like a theoretical piece, because for me, my upbringing wasn't representative of stability. I had somebody who was in the building trade, and there was a complete lack of stability. So in my mind, I was like almost rebounding against that. So I was looking for certainty, which was basically just if I had a job that provided me with income, I was on a much better wicket than what I grew up with. So that's just an interesting lens through which that, yeah, it was a theoretical proposition to me, but I don't remember it really sort of landing for me, because I was, just get me a job that has an income and I'm winning. So now to talk about what I'm supposed to talk about. I think that interesting, because what Taural mentioned was, develop this ability to be sort of agile and to deal with uncertainty. But I really feel as though we're only now starting to have, at least from a psychological perspective, this discussion around the fact that uncertainty exists, like it's just a part of being human, and it is one of the things we struggle with the most. And individuals have different abilities to change. Some of that is just inherent in how our brains are wired. Some of it is just, perhaps what industries we've grown up with. A lawyer and a traditional engineer, for example, we're really trained in risk and risk aversion, which makes us super good at analysing all sorts of different possibilities and outcomes and identifying risks. But change is not always our friend. So our ability to be able to move through that change sort of cycle, which everyone has, but we move through it in sort of quicker or slower ways. So again, it's, I guess, not just generational, it's what your sort of personal experience is as well. But overlaying that, as we sort of get just older, what we're used to gets more hardwired into our brains. So we have had a long period of time of working with a certain type of technology, and we've gotten used to that one. And then that's been really embedded in just almost like a neural sort of comfort with a rate of change has been like, baked into our sort of system in a sense.
Mhm.
And that rate of change is just increasing and increasing. But we've got these neural pathways that are very nicely formed on, I don't know, desktop software. So we can logically know that we need to change and that we need to change quicker, and we may want to do that, and we have a high-performing mindset and feel that we're capable of embracing that, but actually implementing it could be a completely different thing altogether. And just to acknowledge that is there means that we're not sort of then beating ourselves up if that change doesn't come quite as easily as it might for somebody else, and then it just enables you to actually do it quicker because you can see what those roadblocks are and address them and just move through it that bit easier. So I think it's interesting because we're talking about generations, and I was just having a conversation like, look, the advantage of being slightly older is that I'm talking to people with kids who are 20, 21, 22, 23, and they're looking at it from their kids' perspective, and they're saying, look, my kids don't know AI any better than what I do. They're still, struggling with implementing AI and what it means for them. It's not like you're born in that generation and go, yay, I know how to use AI. But what I think they will have an advantage in is just this sort of cadence of change. Like it will just become a bit natural in their workforce that they are sort of just, yeah, sure, we're going to embrace this new technology, press a button. When we first started with computers, if you press the wrong button, you
deleted everything you
for
typed.
like 2 hours. You might have killed the entire system. Whereas these days it's all about what does this button do, and we'll swipe right, and it's just a different rhythm. And it's not to say
Definitely.
that we're all awesome, so we'll embrace all of that pretty easily. Like it's not, I don't want to give this impression that we're dinosaurs and we don't know how to use it. It's more just a saying that we have wisdom to bring to this, and that wisdom is also useful. Like we haven't been burdened by only knowing a world where when you're bored, you pick up your phone. We do have a reference point for a world where that didn't exist. And having that reference point is important and something we can gift.
That's a good point, actually. Like, I was talking with my 8-year-old son the other day, and we were talking about street directories and maps, right?
Yellow pages.
I know, yellow pages. Like for him, like he thinks about it in terms of, in Google Maps I can do this, in Apple Maps I can do this. Like I told him, look, like we didn't have Apple Maps and Google Maps growing up. We used a straight map, and then I actually still have one in the back of my truck. Right?
Yeah.
It's underneath.
Resulted in all kinds of divorce.
Yeah, it's underneath the tire where I keep the spare tire, mainly because I'm just keeping it as a souvenir, not because I'm ever going to use it. So I actually opened it up and took it out and showed it to him, and they said, "This is the page of Ashburton where we live."
Yeah. Well, and this is the weird thing, and like now we're going to talk about geography, which is basically my weakest point, but. Just that visual landscape of getting out a map and being able to see where you are. Whereas when you're in Google Maps all the time, I have no idea whether I'm going left or right.
Yeah.
It takes me there, I land. Could be anywhere.
Absolutely.
But when you do have that perspective of a physical map, you do see where you are in the landscape. And we sort of miss that sometimes because it's all sort of embedded. It's going to say, look, more advantages to being of our generation. Like they're just coming thick and fast.
But I think that's part of the resilience that we have, because actually we navigated both the physical world without the digital aids, and then we actually got used to using digital. And now actually we are starting to become a lot more digitally savvy. And I think that's where I really see, a lot of hope for the future for Gen X, because I feel like, with what's happening with the younger generation, they've grown up in a predominantly digital world. And sometimes when it comes to actually thinking about how do you create that unique differentiator in terms of a business, like for them, it's all about the thinking that they have in their digital sense, right? But we actually have that ability to think about physically, this is what happens. If we think about physical supply chain, these are the different bits that go here and there. And then from digitally, we can actually think, this means this information flowing from this system to the other system, and then we can actually bring the two together and then look at how does that create value, right? To me, I think that's one of the biggest things that Gen X has as a benefit that we can take forward, because the future generations probably won't have the ability to do that in a strong sense, right? And if you really look at the businesses that are really starting to differentiate themselves in the digital world, they're not actually the digital natives, right? Because if you really look at it, the digital natives, their lifespan is actually quite short, right? They come up fast, they create a lot of value, but then they at the same time they actually go down quite fast. Think about MySpace, right? What happened to them? Right, and I'm sure there are a lot of other companies between MySpace and Facebook that came and went, right? And think about Yahoo, think about Yahoo, think about Alta Vista, right? They are all digital natives, right? They didn't last a long time, but then.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing there is a natural market movement. We just, because of the ability to drive digital technology puts the foot down on the tempo of the market in certain cases. I would say it's a consolidation piece. MySpace was one of many social media early, prototypical social media platforms. Well, there's a winner there, right? And that winner's been around for a while, right? But so the fact that MySpace and others rapidly grew and then went away, that simply means in the free market, people made a decision and a consolidation of power happened.
Absolutely.
It happened in a quick amount of time. It happened in a quick amount of time, but that's just a compressing of the time frame. Yeah. You can see the same thing about the automotive market, which has been going for close to 200 years. Yeah. And you can see 150, 175. You can see how we've gone from wildly differentiated to a narrow focus of just several larger holding companies. But I want to get back to that was me splitting hairs. Sorry.
No, it's all good. No, I think like the point that I'm trying to make was, a lot of businesses that are surviving into the future are the ones that actually can combine that digital and physical and create business models that combine the two. And that's the point that I was trying to make, right? So things like MySpace, Alta Vista, Yahoo, everything actually came and went because they were digital native. Their business model was purely digital. But if you think about the Walmarts, the Woolworths, the things that everything that Berkshire Hathaway invests in, like food, everything, yes, they have a huge physical element, but a lot of the businesses that Berkshire Hathaway invests in, actually, they've invested quite heavily in their digital infrastructure.
I'll say simply 2 points to that. One is the broader thesis that the physical, the non-digital, the non-technology driven remains important. Completely agree with you. Yeah, completely agree with you on that. And the second point, which I think is the main point you're trying to hit on, was around, and I'll describe it this way. I think we're uniquely positioned to be able to straddle both that non-technical, non-digital world and the digital world, because millennials, perhaps to a certain degree, but if you did grow up in the 70s and 80s, people joke about it, and there's memes about all sorts of horrible things you wouldn't do, from lead paint to no seatbelts to people smoking while pregnant, whatever. Right? There's all sorts of jokes around that. Yeah. But essentially, that world, that visceral life that we grew up in, and also the necessity to adapt to digital technology in order to be relevant and to also, out of interest and curiosity, whatever, we've had to very clearly navigate both sides, and that's a tremendous advantage. It will continue to remain a tremendous advantage. That's at least the way I look at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the other thing, that's definitely one of the things. And the other thing that I was going to talk about was more just this decentralization that's happening across a lot of industries, right? And some of them are obviously being disintermediated because of certain technology elements, and some of them are actually being disintermediated because the traditional organizational structures are quite complex, and now they're starting to realize this. I mean, this has happened in Woolworths to a large degree as well, right? If you take a look at Woolworths, they actually still have the core as the Woolworth Group, and they've broken up certain divisions as kind of decentralized business units, and Woolies exists alongside those other business units, right? So this is happening in a lot of industries, and I think if you apply that to the Gen X lens, where I see the Gen X having opportunities is more thinking about how do we actually build those businesses of the future that actually are smaller, but at the same time be able to leverage the efficiencies of scale, because we've seen organizations operate at that efficiencies of scale, right? But
I think we've seen the pendulum go, and I think what you're talking about is, again, I see it from a systemic point of view. Yeah. I think there's a pendulum swing there. Yeah. One of my favorite songs by a band called NoFX, very Gen X, punky, is called "Dinosaurs Will Die." And because I've been in technology for a long time, I've been saying, people, if you're not if you're not going to adopt technology, eventually you're going to fail out. And I think what you described are just wonderful illustrations of dinosaurs dying. And again, us being able to navigate that and understand how to create new systems, I think is probably a superpower that we have potentially uniquely compared to others who haven't seen the pendulum go back and forth.
Absolutely.
And you sort of hit on a few things there too, because we are, I think, companies move from centralized to decentralized to centralized. You'll see conglomerates that once upon a time were in favor, then in markets, for example, they decide, no, conglomerates are evil, we're not getting valued at the appropriate rate, let's spin companies out so that we can be valued appropriately, based on our assets. And then somebody else will say, but the diversification within our portfolio then helps. And so then we're back to sort of conglomerates again. I mean, and again, just going back to that, having the stage in life as opposed to maybe generationally, but just purely stage in life wisdom to have had that, again, lived experience, to have seen the different stages and the different examples, and then that overlay of technology. As you said, we have had to straddle a world where technology wasn't there, and I was sort of then explaining to me when I started out, started in, as I said, it's not a first adopter. You do not describe lawyers as first adopters. And I was in one of the bluest of blue chip, top tier law firms, and we were like the latest of the late adopters in terms of technology. So I was standing there at midnight faxing 200-page documents. I saw somebody on a bicycle the other day, and it reminded me of the days that we would have couriers riding their bikes. Do you remember that? Couriers on their bikes delivering the 300-page documents between law firms so that we could get physical signatures onto paper. And just the mere there's a lot of wisdom in just having
that industry is still there, Lisa. It's called the last mile delivery, right?
And I have to explain to people, when you're swearing because the internet is down, and then you realize that literally every facet of your life is connected to the internet. And then I have to say, but, with the advantages of technology comes this inherent sort of thing that we have to deal with, which is the annoyance of the internet going down. But so then we can, as a generation, say, well, we didn't have that problem when we had a courier riding the bike around town. But we have to remember that most of the time that was the only way we could get our documents around. So,
absolutely.
but I guess that was a very long way of not making any point at all, and just
you did, Lisa. You did make an excellent point there, right? Which is the one that you started on, which is what I'm going to go back to as our closing statement for this session today, which is the pendulum slinging back and forth in terms of going conglomerates and breaking up and then going back to conglomerates. And I think that's where I'm actually starting to see what the new conglomerates are. The new conglomerates are actually no longer the old conglomerates, because the old conglomerates, when they combine them as, we are big business now, right? But the new conglomerates are actually not that. They're actually micro enterprises built within the same big business, right? And I think that's the new structure that we're starting to see emerge, which is what the new conglomerates are. So at a P&L level, at a top financials level, you can actually still aggregate and get the benefits of diversification. But at the operational level, you actually still have the decentralized operation that's focused on what we're doing well and doing it well with technology's help. This is what I was actually talking about when I was talking to Ian Robinson, the CIO of Life Without Barriers. Right, so he comes from a very, very heavy technology, heavy engineering based industries like rail and energy and utilities, right? But now he's in a services industry which is very much human focused, right? And then he talks about like Life Without Barriers is one of the biggest care service providers. So they need to compete with these small organizations that have come up that are a lot more digitally savvy and provides much more intimate services to the people that they're caring for. But they have the scale. In order to get the efficiencies of scale, they need to think like a small business that actually can provide that efficiency. And what he was really optimistic about was the possibilities of how technology can actually enable that, what I call the deep personalization of service that people can provide while still being a large organization. So it's like you still operate like a large organization in terms of the efficiencies of a conglomerate, right? But and the diversification you get, but then in terms of the personalization, you can actually still provide deep personalization because technology actually enables that, right? To me, I think that's where Gen Xers can actually really start to come to life, because Gen Xers actually have seen the pendulum shift back and forth. And we know that, in the top end of conglomerates where there were a lot of things that were good, but then we knew what was bad. Now, when we actually started to see these new organizations emerge, we are quite well positioned to be able to actually help organizations go into that new model of what the new conglomerates should look like. So from your legal perspective, obviously, that adds value to what you bring to the table. And in terms of what I do, when I talk to customers about digital transformation, I know how it helped me. And obviously, when you, Taural, you go and talk to people, the small businesses that you talk with, you know what the message is for them, right? So, and that's a perspective that other generations might have missed out on. To me, I think that's kind of like the thing that we have really gained as being lucky in being where we are today. What are your thoughts on that in terms of just closing out, in terms of the final thoughts?
Oh, look, there's definitely a lot of hope just from what you've said. Like, I basically agree that, as I said, we're in that stage where we've just got the wisdom that we can apply the technology not just in a vacuum, but to, how we're moving forward and applying those sort of different lenses to it as well. We're just in that next stage of deploying our wisdom.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And thanks again for coming on the show today, Lisa. And Taural,
thank you for having me. It's been fun. Any
closing thoughts from you, Taural?
I love that. I love the sentiment. I hadn't really reflected on the idea of microservices. Microservices is a very particular term used in technology to allow for agility, flexibility, time to market, et cetera, rather than sort of these big, prodigious, software landscapes. And you drew it to an organization. And I never thought about a conglomerate setup. You use technology to your microservices. I'm familiar with that push from decentralized organizations, holacracy, the Spotify method, those types of people. Yeah. Some large organizations talk about, we're going to be agile, right? But I think it's an interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about. So you've given me some food to reflect on. I mean, it was a really great way to conclude. I think we have some benefit that we can bring to the table in that type of a world.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Actually, I was talking about micro enterprises.
Micro enterprises.
Yeah, micro enterprises, which is what organizations like 𝗶 and 𝗫 and the sort of the Transform GE are using in terms of their business model. They're still conglomerates at a top level, but in terms of their individual business lines, they actually have separate P&Ls, and they have clear interfaces defined between different business units.
I mean, it's effectively a microservices approach.
It is the same concept applied to an organization. Exactly. Yeah.
Love it.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining today, Taural. I appreciate, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show as a co-host. I really love having you. And thanks for coming on the show, Lisa. That's it for today's episode of Transformation 2.0. I hope you found insights that will help you lead change with confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformational stories to leaders like you. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn. And if you have a topic or guest you would love to hear on the show, let us know. See you next time.